Hi everyone, it's Laura here for Wow Embossing Powder, and in today's video I'm going to share with you how to create a beautiful floral card using the Emboss Resist watercolor technique. The stamp set that I'll be using today is the gorgeous wallpaper art stamp set by Altenew, which features these beautiful florals, and I'm going to use the coordinating dies as well. And then of course I'm going to use my Wow embossing powders. I'm going to use the Rose Glints, which is a new embossing powder to me, and then I'm also going to use the opaque bright white for my sentiment. I started by stamping my images, and I have some Canson XL watercolor cardstock in my MISTI. I mounted the stamps on the door of the MISTI, and then I am inking them up with my Wow embossing ink. This is a clear sticky ink so that when I go ahead and I coat my images with embossing powder, the powder will stick to those areas. The embossing powder that I'll be using today, as I mentioned, is the Wow Rose Glints embossing powder, which is absolutely gorgeous. It's nice and shiny and I love the color. I'm using my heat gun by Wow to melt the embossing powder, and I'm using it on the higher setting. This is a dual speed heat tool. And then, because I didn't stamp the images correctly, I'm using my embossing pen to fix those areas and create the details that were missing. At this point I can coat those areas again with the same Rose Glints embossing powder and heat set it with my heat gun, and it will look like I had the perfect stamping from the get-go. I decided to do some watercoloring today, and for that I'm using my Altenew watercolor palette. This is a pan of 36 nice and bright colors, and I'm going to use some blues, purples and aquas today. To color all the flowers I used the colors Desert Night and Midnight Violet. I am layering them on top of each other, and I am using the wet on wet technique. So I'm going in with a paintbrush that is loaded with some clean water. I'm coating the areas that I want to paint with the clean water, and then I'm going to drop the pigments in those areas just at the base of the petals, and I'm mostly leaving the water to move the pigments around. I can help it a little bit with my paintbrush if I see that the colors aren't moving too much, but at this point I am just adding a first coat of color, so I am not spending a lot of time on this. I am, as I said, just coating the areas with water and dropping the pigments at the base of the petals. Because we have the embossing powder rather than just traditional stamping on the images, we have some raised edges on the petals of the flowers in this case, but on any of the areas of the images really. And these raised edges will form some wells so that the pigments and the water will be confined to those areas. So normally what you would do with watercolors is, if you have two adjacent areas, you would not normally paint them one right after the other, because the pigments and the water would migrate otherwise between the two areas and you will not have a good control of the look of your watercolor piece. In this case though, because we have the raised edges created by the embossing powder, we do not have to worry about painting adjacent areas one after the other, so we can move a little bit faster without fear of contamination. In the video today, I'm not sharing all the painting for all the flowers. The method is the same for all of them, and as you can see, I already went ahead and started painting the other two off camera. Once the first one was completely dry, I went back in with a second layer, and in this case I'm going to do a little bit of a more controlled watercoloring. So I'm going to do the wet on dry technique. What this means is that I'm not going to wet the areas before adding the pigment, but I'm going directly with the pigment onto every single petal. I am distributing the pigments at the base of the petals because that is where we will have the darkest areas, and then I'm going to clean off the paintbrush, dip it into the clean clear water that you can see I have on my desk, and use that to blend out the pigment. Also for the second layer I'm going to use again Desert Night and Midnight Violet, and I'm layering them on top of each other so that I can create a little bit of color variation, which in turn creates more visual interest on the card. Just remember that it is important that you rinse off your paintbrush after you add the pigment to the base of the petals, otherwise you will not be able to create a nice blend because you will have way too much pigment on your paintbrush and you will basically create one solid petal because, again, you will not be able to create that nice blend. So clean your paintbrush often and use a little bit of water, so the paintbrush has to be damp, not completely soaked, to drag out your pigments and create shading. Off camera, I went ahead and added the second layer of paint to the two flowers at the bottom of the sheet, and then I went ahead and started painting the leaves. I'm going back to my wet on wet techniques for the leaves, so I am wetting them with some almost clean water before going in with my pigments. I'm using Desert Night at the base of the leaves and then I'm adding a little bit of Mountain Mist, which is kind of a mint green, in the centers. I'm using Desert Night because that is the same blue that I have on my leaves, and having this same shade of blue in both the leaves and the flowers is going to give a bit of a more cohesive look to the whole piece. I also wanted to draw your attention to the fact that I am aware that my clean water is not so clean anymore, but the pigments are diluted enough that when I add it to my paper, it doesn't really have any color to it. But, you know, the proper way to do it, or the safer way to do it, would be to just use some completely clean water. Also in this case, I'm adding a second layer to intensify the contrast and smoothen out the look of my watercolor a little bit more. And then once this step was done and everything was completely dry, I moved on and die cut everything with the coordinating dies to the Wallpaper Art Stamp Set by Otenu. I also did some more die cutting off camera. I cut some more Canson XL watercolor cardstock using the rectangle die in the Studio Katia Darling Ribbon and Dotted Frames dies. It got a little bit stained from my cutting plates, so I'm using my Tombow Mono eraser to remove the smudges. I also die cut some black cardstock using the Dotted Patterns Set 1 dies, also by Studio Katia, and then I created this frame out of some white cardstock using the Dotted Square Frame die, again by Studio Katia. I wanted to turn the frame into a metallic frame with the same shade as my images, so what I did is I tapped my embossing ink pad directly onto the frame so that I would release some ink and coat it with embossing ink. I then coated everything with my Rose Glints embossing powder by Wow and heat set the embossing powder with my heat gun. In order to get a nice and thick frame, I repeated the whole process a second time. The only thing you need to be careful about is to wait for your embossing powder to be completely cool before you go ahead and ink it up again. I also decided that I wanted to add some shimmer to this black panel, so I started by adding some droplets with my Spectrum Noir Sparkle ink in the color Pink Champagne. The color of the ink will not really show through, so this is like adding clear sparkle for all intents and purposes when you use black cardstock. It's not the same on white, obviously, but on dark cardstock you will only see the sparkle. And for this reason I decided to use my metallic ink pots, also by Spectrum Noir. These have some pigments, so they will show on dark cardstock. And to get the shade similar to my Rose Glints embossing powder, I mixed two colors, and these are Antique Bronze and Burnished Copper. I then moved on and started adhering everything. I used this glue by Thermoweb with a fine tip applicator to add some adhesive behind this thin frame so that I could adhere it to my watercolor cardstock background. Now, the process at this point is a little bit backwards because I will decide at the end that I want a black frame all around my card. So if you are following this tutorial and want to make the card the same as I did, the best thing to do is to add your black frame at this stage because it's going to be easiest. I didn't, because I didn't know at this point that I was going to want one. So the next step was to arrange the flowers on my card. And one thing that you can do is to use press and seal at this point. You will press it onto your florals, you can then pick them all up and they will stay as you arrange them. I don't have that product, but another great thing you can do is use washi tape, or in my case I used purple tape. That was the purple tape I used to secure the dies to my images when I die cut them. And the great thing about this product is that it doesn't tear your paper and you can reuse it. So I am, getting the most out of my supplies here. With the flowers all kept together by my purple tape, I could add glue at the back and then move them all at once back and adhere them to my card base. And just at this point I'm going to remove my purple tape, and I'm also using a heavy acrylic block to hold my images down while the glue dries. This is the stage at which I decided that I wanted a black frame around my card front. You can see there is an attempt at creating one with a marker. It didn't work very nicely, it wasn't very precise, so what I did is I die cut some black cardstock using the larger rectangle die that I used for my card base, as well as the die that I used for the frame. This would be the Darling Ribbon and Dotted Frames dies and the Dotted Square Frame die by Studio Katia. I obtained this black frame and I glued it around my card base, and I really like the look this way. I decided to add a little bit of extra detail to this black panel, so I'm adding some dots in different sizes using a Sakura Jelly Roll pen in the size 10. And lastly, I heat embossed my sentiment with white embossing powder by WOW over a strip of black cardstock. I chose the greeting Miss You from the Wallpaper Art stamp set by Haute Tenue, and I adhered the banner on top of the flowers. The last step was to adhere everything to my card base. This is a pre-cut and pre-scored A2 sized card base by scrapbook.com, and I'm using a tape runner to adhere everything together. Here is the final result. A bit of a different card for me. The color palette is a little bit unusual for what I'm used to when I make floral cards, but I have to say that I love the combination of the colors that I have on the flowers and that beautiful rose glints embossing powder. And that's it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I inspired you to create your own cards using the Emboss Resist watercolor technique. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more card making and paper crafting inspiration. Thank you all so much for stopping by, and have a great day.